Good morning. I'm Michael Fries. My wife and I have served as missionaries in Southeast Asia for 16, 17 years. Several months ago, I did a workshop that was trying to explain about honor shame culture. And I thought this would be of value to put out there for others that may be of interest to listen to some of the things that we've learned and some of the things we've learned by our own hard knocks and experience as well. I start off the workshop by mainly pointing to a couple of areas. Several years ago, we were invited to come at 4 p.m. for a wedding. We arrive at 4 p.m. Not only was there no other guests, but the bride and the groom themselves were not even dressed to receive guests. Another time we show up at some friend's house, and when we get there, they bring out fine china, very nice glasses, and they show us hospitality that we're like, boy, we are so undeserving of all this. Another situation that came up along with those first two was when we were just wondering, we're looking for someone to help us around the house doing some cleaning and some different things, and we go to some close friends of ours in this country and asking them for names. And the unusual thing is, I know these people know hundreds and hundreds of people, have many family members. Yet when I asked them for a name of someone, they couldn't come up with any. Why is that? And I'd ask these questions about other things along the way. Yeah, they eat. People in the country we minister in eat, they sleep, they live, they get married, they die. But there's so many things about that confuse us. Even when we witness to people and talk about the God of heaven, their responses really mainly are not about spiritual things, but their questions are about, well, how do I do weddings? How do I do funerals? And I'm thinking, don't they care about the practical working of life? And so these are questions that we have had. And in my better understanding of honor shame culture, I think there are some answers to this that help us understand things. This is titled Life and Ministry in Honor Shame Cultures: How to Save Face When Face Isn't That Important to You. So the information that I'm going to be presenting here has taken my understanding of the culture that we minister into from like an AM radio quality station to something that you're watching in full HD color, sound, and everything. This truth I'm going to be presenting has led me from catching cultural bombs with my bare hands to now defusing these things with like the gear of a SWAT team. And it doesn't eliminate all the bombs, it doesn't eliminate all the static that we might have, but at least it's helped me understand the culture that we're trying to serve our God in, to understand it better. And the cool thing to me about this workshop that was presented several months ago, in my preparation for it, I realized it's not just for those who are ministering in another culture. But understanding, at least honor shame culture, as I'm going to present here, is helping understand the culture of the Bible as well. That would be, I believe, far more closer to an honor shame culture than what many in the West would follow or understand. And in another way that's kind of probably maybe true for others, it helps me understand my spouse better as well. So it's not just ministering in a foreign culture, it's helping understand our Bible, and it's helping understand our spouse better as well. Something that I have grown and appreciate and still am growing in. The resources that I've used for this really have helped me along the way. The first one was the Honor Shame 201 video on YouTube. It's a video with lots of pictures and different stories and things, and I was first sparked in my interest about honor shame culture through this video. It's a long video, but I think it's well done, by Jason Georges. Then he also has a book called The 3D Gospel, which is I think about 70 pages. An excellent introduction into it. And then he also followed that up with another book called Ministering in Honor Shame Cultures, and that's by Georges and also Baker as well. And then another book that has helped me in understanding this topic is an older book that I have really valued by Roland Mueller called The Messenger, The Message, and Community. It's really 3 books that the man wrote that I think are very valuable. He wrote them several years ago, but very practical and very useful. Now, when we talk about the honor shame culture, those who research this stuff gave a high percentage to me. About what percentage of the world cultures are predominantly honor shame in their cultural bent? They say that 80% of the world cultures are predominantly honor shame in their acclamation. Now, I'm not trying to say that all of those 80% are identical. There are aspects of the honor shame culture that are stronger in some and others not as they're weaker in. He's going to break them down. I'm going to explain a little bit later 7 differences, and all of them aren't as true in all the countries or as prominent. Here's a map that shows that Asia, Islamic countries, I don't know, some of the stories will come from Islamic countries that I'll talk about, but South America and Africa, I don't know the predominance for some of those. But for the culture that I've been exposed to, I can say that many of these things are very true. Western countries, there's a dynamic that has been presented that I think it's pretty accurate, that the bend that people feel when they do wrong. Do they feel guilt? Do they feel shame? Or is it fear? And it's not that one person feels all one or all three at the same time. Typically, the culture you're in kind of bends you more towards one or the other. And it's not so much that, once again, it's not all one or all the other, because we do, even in America, feel shame. We feel fear about doing some things. But if I'd have to put it, I think we're a little bit more bent towards, in America, bent towards guilt than we are towards shame. Now, it's not to say there aren't some subcultures inside of American culture, like the military, that would be very honor-based, and even, as crazy as it sounds, junior high groups. I had someone ask me one time about cultures and stuff, that they said this person grew up in a very honor-shame-based culture, but their parents were very guilt innocence. And what I thought about that, I don't have statistic analysis, but I'll give you my opinion on this. I think that majority, 90, 95%, maybe higher, of your cultural bent comes from your parents, not so much your culture. But there's definitely overlap, and it's all not cut and dried. So I think your parents are what's going to motivate and drive what differences there are in things like that, though the culture around it will help you expose you more. In the country we personally minister in, I think that, as you see on the circle, it's a lot closer to shame and honor and shame. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. So how do I define honor and shame? One person wrote that honor and shame is a person's social credit score. When you try to get a credit card, you have a credit score that people are going to gauge you by. And this is honor and shame is really pretty much the same thing. It's just one is higher and one is lower on the same scale. Is your social credit score, your clout, your influence, your testimony before others higher, or is it lower? So the honor and shame is really actually the same concept to me. And for us in the West, what you think about me, I don't care. It's all black and white. I'll do my own thing. But that's not as true in other cultures as it is, at least for my upbringing in the West. And there's a very strong group concern in an honor-shame culture. Wikipedia defines it pretty lengthy, a shame society. I kind of summarized it as a shame culture is defined as a culture that uses shame and ostracism as means to control children and social order. So you can see right there that it's parents that are using the shame and ostracism to control how their children act in the social order. That's kind of summarized from the Wikipedia definition there. Now I'm going to look at this time. I would like to look at some differences between the honor-shame culture and a guilt-innocence culture. And it's not to say that one is better than the other. It's just trying to point out the differences that if you go to a foreign culture, if you're working with some families that are of different culture, some of the perspectives they have that are in many ways different than what in the West we would normally see. So I'm going to list out here on the screen a word. But then I'm also going to put in parenthesis as well something that we in the West would see when we perceive this. It's perceptions, it's differences, and I'm not trying to say one is completely wrong and one's completely right. And there are some pros and cons for many of these dynamics. So I'm just going to give you some of these different things. These are not original with me. They came from the Ministering in Honor Shame Cultures by Georges and Baker. But this is kind of my own input on some of these things. There's the collective group mentality is number one. If I had to title Honor Shame Cultures, I think to me a better definition of a culture like this is a group mentality, a collective group perception of life. Honor shame, yes, is because of that group mentality, but I'm going to explain this, and these are all linked, so it's not like cut and dried. But collectivism and group mentality. In the West, we are always, independent or trying to be, self-thinking, and people want us to stand on our own 2 feet. Where when I ask questions and talk about spiritual things and talk about the gospel, rarely are the questions that are responded back to me about truth questions. They're more often, almost always, how do I live with my family? How do I live around weddings and funerals? They see themselves not allowed to almost make a thought, but see themselves in the group. They're tied to their family. Their thought processes, their thinking is on their family, their aunts, their uncles, their grandparents. One thing that surprised me early on in Cambodia is that when young people start to work, before they're married, they'll give 70 to 80% of their income to their parents. I think that's a helpful thing in many ways. In America, many times it's the parents that are still supporting their kids even when they're working. And even when Asian and the culture we're in, when they marry, oftentimes they'll still be giving 20 to 30% of their monthly income to their parents. Just showing the group collective mentality that's there. One illustration that Georges gave that I thought was good back in April of 2013 when there was the Boston Marathon and somebody bombed the marathon at one point of it. It was a Chechen man that was, come to find out, the main culprit, whatever you call it, the person who did it. His uncle was lashing out at these two people that did it. He was outraged over the repercussions that were coming to him. And this is the words that this uncle, this Chechen uncle, he's very ethnic, was getting on to his nephew for doing this. He says to him on the interview, "You put a shame on our entire family," the Tsarnaev family. I guess that's the name of the guy who did it. And he continues, "You put a shame on the entire Chechen ethnicity. Everyone now puts that shame on the entire ethnicity, our own country." And see, this guy, when he was on the air trying to plead for this nephew to come back, he was talking about the shame of his family, shame of his country, shame of his ethnicity around the world. And when I read this, I thought to myself, did any American think, oh, it's those Chechens who are really bad, or oh, it's the Tsarnaev family that's really bad? Not at all. Why is that? Because we're independent thinking. We're very individualistic. And so Americans, but that's what he felt at that time was the shame that came about because of the wrong of his nephew. Now, there's another aspect. I highly praise a more group mentality for individuals in the West. It's something that we think too lightly of. But there is an aspect in parenthesis, you see, it's conformity. So we often see collective thought, group mentality as a bad thing. It's conformity. No one can think for themselves. You got to be your own person. And so many times we promote this in the West. And I understand there's a healthy and unhealthy aspect of it. In the culture we're in, marriage candidates for their children are oftentimes strongly chosen or very much chosen by parents of the bride and the groom. It's rarely totally by themselves. And it's something that is like a shocking thing to us, that parents would be involved in choosing. Well, many times those parents can give a better perspective on things than what their children themselves can often see. Let me rework that a little bit. Okay. The highest honor for many children in Asia, I've heard this true of other countries, not just this one that we're in, but is to their goal, their drive is to build a nice house for their parents. That's what their thinking is. They wish they could just build a nice house for their parents. So I've seen some that go off to another country to work and pretty much just are totally working. Their life is spent working in other countries, making more money than they could earn here. And what they do with their money, they send it back to their parents so the parents can build a nice house. When I'm referring to this honor shame culture, it's really more a group mentality. And this is just one criteria. What will my family say? What will the group say is a very strong, prominent thing in their mentality. The next thing is patronage, another dynamic that's in this culture. It's a reciprocal relationship defined between two unequal parties, one that's rich and one that's poor. Now, is this a bad thing when a rich person helps a poor person? No, not at all. In the West, oftentimes, we are focused a lot more on sending funds through organizations, set up programs, encourage the government to support different things. And as I think maybe once upon a time it was tried here, but many times those organizations, the BBC said this isn't original with me, that the majority of these organizations exist to help the employees of those organizations, not so much the poor that they were intended to help. I think many in this culture, this country realizes that, and so instead of helping the poor through an organization that will better understand things, they just dynamically help the relatives or other poor as well through that. Maybe in schooling, paying for medical needs, paying for a lot of different things. In the New Testament, Paul, the apostles, definitely appears that they were aided by wealthy believers. So, it's not something that is questionably wrong. We often tend to think of this as, we got to stand up for ourselves, earn ourselves. Well, there's a dynamic to patronage that is a good thing. But as you can see the dynamic here, it also creates dependence and corruption. And though the dependence necessarily isn't wrong, a child has to depend on their parents, poor has to depend on the wealthy. It's not necessarily wrong, but it's when that becomes an absolute dependence that's required and there's rules attached to it. I don't know the whole story. There's some good books out there on this. You can email me. I'll give you my email address in the end if you'd like to correspond. But because of the rich, oftentimes in cultures that I'm familiar with, those rich expect loyalty of those who are following them. And that expectation is not just slight, but even to the point where it would go beyond, go to the nth degree. I'll just put it that way. And this is how politics in many countries of the world are accomplished. It's sad, but unfortunately, this is true for many churches as well in this culture, the same type of model. The pastor supports the people, and not the people supporting the pastor. The pastor supports his people, those that are coming, through his multitude of networking connections that he's made, networking with others, even foreigners, or B, with with organizations that he's come in contact with. So even denominations or different denominations, they have a handout event. Hey, let's get our people to go to that. Or through short-term teams or individuals, foreigners coming over, wealthy people. And we try to make a connection with those people. And the pastor tries to facilitate that for the people. I ask you, should a pastor be supporting and should he ever be giving to his people that's coming to his church? I answer, okay, in a case of an extreme emergency where there's maybe a flood and the pastor has to reach out, yes. But I think the majority, the rule, not the exception, should be that the people are supporting the pastor. I know this is a concept that may surprise some, but I think that's a healthy thing. It's a biblical thing. It's not just me. One other thing I wanted to bring up here was that several months, maybe a couple years ago, China was making some inroads into the Southeast Sea and building islands and things. And a lot of the countries in Southeast Asia tried to stand up and censure and make a strong voice against what China was doing. One of the countries, once again, that I heard about, it also was a part of the group, but they vetoed and didn't let the other Southeast Asian countries speak against China. And it wasn't a surprise, I don't think, but I thought it was eye-opening that a couple of days later, that country, China, gave $400 million in loans to another country. In probably appreciation for this veto. Now, those $400 million, I don't think were at all expected to be paid back, but this was appreciation. So patronage, it's something that in our ears as Westerners is kind of abusive and horrible, but it does have very much valuable things, and it's something that is to be understood very much so in an honor shame culture. Another thing that is surprising to me, but I think has helped understanding this culture, was indirect communication. Third aspect is indirect communication. The relationship is valued over offenses, and thus it's very hard to communicate directly. So when there is a problem, if you ask the person, is there a problem? They will answer very quickly and bluntly, no, there's no problem. Now, they know there's a problem, but they want to save face with the relationship and not admit it. So you ask them a question, what's wrong? Where is something? They'll give an answer, but that answer may be more to save face than to speak as directly. I don't want to say correctly, directly, because well, I'll get to that in just a minute. So if you ask someone, will you come to my event? Will you come to my class? Will you come to my meeting? Oh, yes, absolutely, I'll be there. But they don't show up. And you're, wait a minute, I had 3 people said they were going to show up and nobody showed up. And so what they're trying to do is save face, and if you're going to ask them a direct question, they're going to answer directly to make you feel good, to make you, so like I said, save face. So our approach to ministry is not so much to focus on an event, trying to get people to come to the event where we really have to twist their arm and make them be deceitful and dance around the answer to save face with us. It's more trying to focus on individuals. So when that time came, as I mentioned earlier, about looking for individuals to help my wife with some work around the house, those people that we knew very well, good friends of ours, who had to have known hundreds and do know hundreds of people. They're people, they're sellers at different places, and they know lots of people. They couldn't come up with anybody. I totally believe the reason they couldn't come up with a name was because they wanted to save face with us and not giving us the name of someone who was going to not be as well done. So they'd rather save the relationship with us than give us the name of someone who may not be as good to us as they want. Then maybe it'd steal something. And I've had more than a few people, people, they just, they won't give me an answer. And I'm like, why is that? Well, I understand that a little bit better now due to the indirect communication. So you have indirect communication, and for us, as Westerners, this can often seem as lying or deception. And they will not tell you something to offend you or to see you lose face. Along the way, I've tried to come up with some literature, did a radio ministry, and I had to come up with a title or how to word things. And so I asked them, does the name of this song, does the name of this title of this booklet, does the title for this radio program seem okay? The problem was, if you're asking for their approval, they're going to give it to you. Oh, yeah, that sounds great. And so I'm learning that when I want the input of a national, I need to word my question in such a way that it's not, yes, I like your idea, or no, but for them to come up with a title of some kind that gives it, well, here's what I'm trying to talk about, this is what and then they come up with a word. Another dynamic is the event orientation. There's a group mentality. The event doesn't begin till the guests are there. And it's not vice versa. You don't start the party before the guests. And so when we were invited for a wedding at 4 p.m., we arrived at 4 p.m. Needless to say, we learned our lesson. No one was anywhere nearby, and later they would say to me, oh, you should show up between 5:30 and 7. So I realize that now when we're talking about times for something, that it's more a general idea. And yes, they understand 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock, but there's an event orientation that something happens, that's more important than the time aspect. Back to in my own marriage, one time my daughter, living in another time zone, was talking to my wife, and my wife and I had to be leaving right away. We were needing to get to someplace quickly. And my wife picks up the phone, and we need to be leaving in 2 minutes, and she answers as if no calm or no concern in her voice at all. How are you doing? I'm like, come on, we need to leave. And she's talking perfectly fine and perfectly calm. And that's partly because she has a little bit more honor-shame basis in her upbringing. And so this event orientation of the event's more important than the time. The relationship is more important than the time aspect. So event orientation, the Western aspect of that is tardiness or even being lazy. We want to get annoyed by this. We want to get upset. And once again, in our Western mindset and culture, we have to realize the relationship should be more pressing than the time event to start by a basis of law. Now there's a dynamic. Yes, I know we do need to be prompt, and we need to be cordial and respecting of other people's time. So there's a dynamic. Once again, I'm not saying one's right and one's wrong, though I guess gave words tardy and lazy as giving it more of a negative connotation. This is another aspect, social roles. Americans often, though I realize there's differences, do not like prominence and honor. When we would go to different churches, we, as a special guest, are giving honor. And if they're having a meal there, they'll let us go first through the lines where everybody's looking at you, and it never fails to feel just awkward. Now, there are times when we don't mind this as Westerners, maybe like at a wedding when we're dressed, fancy, and they have special chairs, and, there's a lot of prominence for the special event. But on an ongoing basis, I don't think as Westerners we want to have a special role. But in a culture, in many cultures of the world, honor-shame cultures, there's an expectation of some being higher in prominence and lower in prominence. If you fight this, many times you'll be dishonoring those who are trying to give the prominence to you, the honor to you. You're causing them shame by not receiving the honor. So I heard this illustration, I don't remember where, but it might have been in the Ministering and Honor Shame books by George's, that there was a foreigner who was an older man in Japan. And in the culture, they were to take their shoes off when they came in and then put on slippers that were provided at the door. The man came into the house where they were going to have a worship service, and the only shoes that were left were pink. And the foreign missionary, realizing this, put the shoes on. And realizing some shame, some discomfort, the guests that were there tried to give him, a different colored pair of shoes, different situation to make him feel more acceptable by the group instead of this older foreigner wearing pink shoes. But the foreigner perceived this situation as a chance to put on humility, and so he was willingly wearing these pink shoes to try and show his humility. When in the eyes of the culture that he was ministering to, they were feeling much shame by the dynamic of what he was doing, feeling that they didn't provide for him. He just didn't understand it. So for us in the West, often we can see this as oppression or up for appearances. Many times in the West, we want to be equal, not just standing in line, but it's the American way that you're supposed to be treated on a par that's similar. In the Asian cultures that I've been around, there's royalty. And not necessarily just those in the king's or family or whatever, but there's special seats, special attention that's being given. We have to be, as foreigners trying to minister in those cultures, we have to be as graceful as possible in receiving these things. We are wealthy and we are powerful in their eyes. And though I realize in the States, many would see me as on the low end, and I think I'd almost qualify for poverty or whatever, which is fine. I'm not complaining at all. But in many cultures, we're perceived as wealthy. And we are wealthy in many ways, given the access to our Western culture and the things in many ways there. Do people in this culture look down on wealthy and really feel begrudging about it? Absolutely. Oftentimes I've heard people talking about the wealthy and how bad they are, but they would rarely say this public. It does lead towards oppression of the poor and more for appearances. Another aspect that kind of goes along with the other things as well, but I wanted to mention was hospitality. In this country where we're serving, and I've seen this in other places, hospitality is on a different level. They will have fancy, lavish decorations and chairs and china that's out. And one of the things when we were ministering in this country early on, we were having a Christmas party, and it was something that I was, expecting, okay, we need to spend time preparing the food and inviting people. The aspect that the Nationals spent the most of their time was preparing a banner. We spent hours preparing a banner so that the guests would feel welcome and understand things. And for me, a banner was the least of my concerns. Just put something up and that's done. They spent hours on this banner. Well, it was hospitality. It was part of it. The most, in many times, it seems like to me, the most important part of a get-together is having a banner. And for us, sometimes when we see the lavishness of the Westerners, we see the wealth that's spent out in this, we would think, what a waste! Oh, look at this! Oh my! But for them, it's lavish and it gives much, here we go, honor. Now they do show hospitality on a mega scale in this culture, as many in Asia. The poor, I've seen them when we have shown up, will just really go out of their way to make us feel at ease. When they receive foreign dignitaries in this country, that they'll have large signs. I remember one time a leader from another country was coming over, and it was in I couldn't understand it. It wasn't in English, but I could definitely tell, I think it was in English. But it wasn't from England or America or China or something. It was in another country. But they had this big sign with 20, 25 different titles: honorable, sovereign, almighty, great. This huge sign with all these titles of this great leader, which for me, I wanted to take a picture of it. It's like, it's a little overkill, don't you think? But this was a way for them to show hospitality to the people that were coming. Hospitality is a big deal in the West, in America. But the way we show hospitality is different. It's a dynamic different. Here, In the States, we would often invite whole families, a family over to spend time with our family, and we'd eat around the table or different things around the couches or something, and that's hospitality. And we've tried to show hospitality in similar Western ways here, and they've most every time flopped. Sometimes it's just the children of the family we invited show up, or sometimes it's just the husband and maybe a buddy of his that show up, when all along we've invited the whole family to show up. And so their hospitality, we all have words for hospitality, but the way you show that is so much different in many ways. Some in the West would see this as an obligation or an ostentation. Not my original word, but I like the word. It's an ostentatious. It's just way too overkill. It's just going through the motions. Many times we would feel we don't like to feel obligated or required, but we realize. But in cultures around the world, that's the norm, and you must do that to once again stay high on that credit scale. Public social credit score is what the definition was for honor and shame, which to me, honor and shame is really the same concept. One is on the high end and one is on the low end. Now, this last criteria is purity. And of the 7 criteria, I kind of weighted the criteria based on what I perceived in the culture that I'm in. But this last one, yes, there is an understanding of purity. And I don't mean like sexual purity alone, but purity as in cleanliness and something. There is a prominence, and it's a little different, but I don't see it as strong. It seems that high school and honor shame cultures, not high school, honor shame cultures really stress this, and I think it's maybe more true in prominence in the Middle East. But there is some things here, it's just not as strong. But the negative from a Western perspective is a Phariseeism or ritualism, that they're going through the motions, they have to do it to stay pure. Now, if you think with me on the New Testament, Pharisees, that they wouldn't touch okay, what was it? Not the prodigal son. The Pharisee, the guy Samaritan, that's it. The Samaritan that was traveling. Well, the religious people didn't want to touch him. And that's true for a lot of people. Oh, what's Jesus doing? Hanging out with those tax collectors. He's dirtying himself. Well, that's a very prominent thing in those countries. Where for us today, in the West, it's a sake of pride to receive, to appear to be helping people, and it almost is a bad thing to be standoffish with others, though many times we do it. So anyway, whatever. So how do we manage life in an honor shame culture? Good question. I haven't figured it out, but I've got a couple of tips that someone else, I think it was in the Ministering in Honor Shame Cultures, that I want to present to you. After I give these 4 things, I'm going to read 3 stories that I think helpfully picture and explain some of these dynamics. And it's not just, they don't give one dynamic, it's like multiple dynamics that are working together. That's why I really like these stories. But first I'm going to talk briefly about this. Number 1, value and show honor. Generally in the West, when somebody gets up to speak, oh, John, come on up and speak for us. Or we say, thank you for a meal. Oh, that was so good. Thank you for the meal. I've been to a couple of conferences where they do this, where they're introducing a speaker and they go on and on about his family, about his accomplishments, about books he's written, about ministries he's involved with. And it's like, wow, this is a great person. Well, that's very much a culture in this country where they show honor and they value it. In the West, oh, John, come on up and speak for us. Or that was a really good meal. Where they would really draw it out, and it would almost seem overkill, or like we're trying to, pad it to make it look really better than what it really is, or, go overkill. I can't think of the better word for overkill, but anyway. So this is something that is very true, and that as a Westerner, I try to understand. As I said before, there's banners in events and things, and at least in Asia, and I think the honor shame cultures in general, there is a better value of honor and showing honor than what we do in the West. 1 Peter says to honor everyone. And this is a command by God. Love the brotherhood, honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor. So it's right there in Scripture to honor everyone. Honor the emperor. And honor is something that in the West is sometimes frowned upon because we look at it as an obligation or maybe too much. But at least in this culture, you better show some honor. The second thing was giving gifts and showing hospitality lavishly. You never visit a house without giving a gift. Now, I mean formally when you're visiting, not when you're going to not just go and buy something at the store. You never show up without a gift. Now, if a national in this culture shows up to visit us without something, many times there's a shame on their part that they will apologize. Oh, I'm sorry I didn't bring anything. I'm sorry I didn't bring something to you. Now, I know in America, we understand giving gifts and stuff, and we kind of have a balance for the culture. When a gift is given, when it should be given, how much it should be given, or in what dynamic. Do we present it boldly or just kind of in passing, give it passing? And it's different in other cultures. And as we've learned, you can't go out of your own culture for gift giving. We have to learn theirs. Ask a close friend. Ask them one-on-one. What's polite in this situation? How should I accomplish this? So in our culture, what we do is we have a fancy pitcher, fancy glasses that are reserved for guests. We use them maybe once in a great while, but oftentimes it's a nice pitcher, nice gift. You get sodas out of the refrigerator, you bring fruit and cookies and you stick it on a plate, and when those guests leave, you bag up those things and send it with them if they didn't finish it, which they usually will just nibble at some of the fruit or cookies anyway. But it's hospitality. It's showing that those people are valuable to us. Even if we don't have fruit, we apologize. Oh, I'm sorry we don't have fruit. Sorry we didn't, that they know we feel a weight for not providing for them more. And that's very much a case here. Use a cover in conflicts when you approach problems and difficulties and disagreements. This is where the cultural expectation comes into full bloom. And it's something that we blow apart. As Westerners, I know I have, okay, we have a bad situation. Let's, for example, your children are taking our children's toys and breaking them. And not by accident, but by their intention breaking and then laughing at them. So, just off the top of my head illustration here, and going to talk to those parents. We have to focus on the relationship more so than the toy that was broken, more so than the offense, and realize, you know what, in a few months, few years, those things will be quickly forgotten, but the relationship with the person is more valuable. It's a dynamic that I'm trying to understand. And then the fourth thing is reconcile symbolically, that when there is a conflict, there is a cover, there is a symbolic way to show people that there is a restoration in the relationship. And one of the cool things is in the prodigal son, when the father receives the wayward son home, what does he do? He wants everyone, not just those servants who hear the conversation between the prodigal son and his father when they come together. He wants everyone to know by throwing a party. Now, this to us might be, well, that's kind of weird in the West, but this is necessary, not for his dad, not for his son alone, but for the reconciliation that will take place among the whole community because of what took place. Now I'm going to explain some problem situations that can occur in honor-shame cultures. These are 3 illustrations, and I think all 3 of them came from the Ministering an Honor-Shame Culture book. I want to give, I don't know the page number, but these are some illustrations that I thought picture the information that I've given so far in a very good format, and I wanted to communicate that with you. So, Ken, I don't think his real name, was a Christian relief worker, and he got into a taxi with a male driver and 2 other men in the car. Very prominent, and where I am as well. And then along the way, they picked up a young woman. As they drove along, hold on here, let me, make sure I'm right in my place in my notes. As they drove along, the 3 men began talking about the various women in their lives, which naturally made the young gal uncomfortable. Then they addressed her. Oh, young lady, come to my house. I will feed you. It will be a relaxing time. and they began discussing among themselves how good it would be to stop the car and spend time with the girl. She was visibly uncomfortable. So, proud of their manly intentions, they turned toward Ken, who was also riding in the car, and asked, "So what do you think? Do you like the idea?" Ken replied, "Well, you could do that if you want to. It's your choice, but it reminds me of a riddle." So they asked, "Oh yeah? What's the riddle?" He gives this riddle. So he walks out of his house onto the street. As he's walking along confidently, he looks over and he says to himself, "Wow, she looks good. I think I'll have her." So he goes over and does his thing with her. He keeps strutting down the street and he sees another and says, "I like her. I think I'll have her too." So he goes over and fulfills his desires with her. Then he sees some unclean food and so takes some for himself. Then a third time he sees a good-looking one, takes her, and then carries on. Ken asks, "Who is he?" Who is he? Maybe better put. The three men in the car think, "Wow, man, that is a real man. That's a great guy." They asked him, "Who is he?" And Ken responded, "He is a dog. God created man to act with honor. He did not create man to live as animals. I choose to live as a man." So in this honor culture that he was living in, these men are shown that they have a bad honor, that they're trying to push themselves on other people here. But in a very indirect way through this riddle, Ken answers them. Ken attempts to use their cultural dynamic, and the story goes that the rest of the trip was fairly quiet. So in using, it's not to say that we go along with the inconsistencies and problems in different cultures, but we have to understand the dynamics in those cultures and try to live as best as possible in those cultures to point to a better culture, and that would be God's culture and God's kingdom. Another story that took place, Afira's conversion, I don't know how to say the name, Afira's conversion from Islam to Jesus brought shame to her family. When her brother was at the mosque during Ramadan, certain men, burning with religious zeal, began discussing those who had left Islam. Afira's name came up, and the men told her brother that he must kill his sister, or they would kill him and his family. They insisted that the killing must be public as a warning to others. They suggested dragging her behind a horse through the village. So Afira's brother called her with an ultimatum: convert back to Islam and marry a man they chose for her, or face a humiliating death. Her brother threatened to find her in the city and take her back to the village. A few months later, Afira's sibling called to invite her home for a meal. She feared it was a trap, but trusted her family anyhow. Her brothers and sisters hosted her to an elaborate dinner. They said nothing about Jesus or the death threats, and had a good time dining together. Afira understood the meal was their olive branch and reacceptance of her back into the family. The food symbolized reconciliation. Now, there's a lot of dynamics that I've already talked about in that story, but you can see there the public reconciliation at the end. This is another one. Dave and Deborah, third one here. Dave and Deborah met Abdul, a married business partner. And this friend of theirs is married. He's on a joint trip, but Abdul has brought along his girlfriend on the trip. Now, this is a problem. Obviously, Dave and Deborah already knew about the girlfriend, but they've been hesitant to confront Abdul directly because he would lose face. And now, Abdul is not a professing believer. This is someone who is not a believer. So I personally agree with this, that you need to focus on Christ and then work out the ramifications of how that works out in the people's lives. But Dave and Deborah, on this business trip with this friend Abdul who brought his girlfriend, they felt that now they must act. If they didn't address the situation, it would appear that they were condoning the actions of Abdul with his girlfriend. Word would get back to their city. People there, including Abdul's wife, Fatima, would assume that they approved of this. So first, Dave and Deborah stated that they did not approve and insisted that the two women sleep in one room and the two men in another. Abdul at first defended himself to save face, but then became withdrawn. Dave and Deborah knew that Abdul assumed that this was the end of their relationship and their business activity together. There's more to the story. To counteract this, Dave and Deborah visited Abdul's home a couple days after they had returned. They greeted Abdul and his wife Fatima and spent time visiting together. They did not mention the incident with the girlfriend. They intentionally commented on some upcoming business tasks, asking Abdul to take on some of the responsibilities as usual. Although they did not speak explicit words of forgiveness, they communicated forgiveness and restoration of relationship through the visit and their words of continued cooperation. Dave and Deborah noted that the relationship with Abdul actually deepened after this. They sensed that he realized their friendship could weather a confrontation, and that when they did confront him, it was out of concern for him and the good of his family. He stepped back from his relationship with the girlfriend and paid noticeably more attention to his wife. Quite the dynamic there that's, just trying to save face, but yet then the problem comes prominent, and then they try to confront him. There's a dynamic give or take, and then they restore the relationship. And it's a dynamic, like Paul says, to be all things to all people, that he might win some. And that's the dynamic of what I am trying to learn. I've lived here in a foreign country for 14, 15, 16 years with understanding these problems, but not having peg holes to hang the thoughts on. It's like having a coat that you can't hang up in a closet. You have to throw your coat down. You know where it's at, but it'd be awful nice if you could hang it up. Well, now with these dynamic differences that were spelled out to me, they're not original with me by any means, but something that is helping me process how to minister and save face, try to show honor, and realize the group mentality that is very prominent in this. Let me pray for those who would listen, and then I'll give my email address at the end. I thank you, Lord, that you are the God and King of all, and that all of us are sinners, and how that sin manifests itself in the guilt, in the shame, and the fear that is prominent in the lives of people. Help us to be faithful ministers. Help us to use your gospel as it is in the power of your Spirit to change lives. And work, I pray, for your glory. It's all these things we pray because of the life and death of your Son, his righteousness that has been accomplished on our behalf. Amen. If you'd like to email me, mfreeze1@gmail.com. And if you have any questions, thanks for listening.